friends. Welcome back for another week of Wednesday night class as we continue to work our way through the Gospel of Matthew. I believe this is our 50th week in the Gospel, and figuring for a couple that I've skipped here and there, that means we have now been cranking through Matthew's Gospel for over a year. Which probably means we're still not giving it the amount of time it deserves, but maybe that's not the argument I should try to make on week 50 of a study of the Gospel of Matthew. We are, however, tonight to one of my favorite passages in Matthew's Gospel, maybe one of my favorite passages in the New Testament. I think it has a lot to offer us if we are willing to hear it. I think that's one of the challenges that this passage has presented for people, is that we haven't necessarily been quick to hear it. We've used it to point fingers or as a selfish check-in, but maybe some of the broader points that it makes have escaped us, especially in its context. So tonight we're in Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46, and we're going to include the first 5 verses of chapter 26 in this conversation. Those 5 verses serve kind of as a summary and transition, but what it has to say when connected to everything Jesus has just said is informative for the early church and certainly for us as well. No delays. I'm not going to take a lot of time. I'm currently in an office where I had to turn off my fan to shoot this video so that you don't have a lot of fan noise. And it is, we're going to go with warm and still. And so the idea of sitting here for 20 minutes sounds brutal. So we're not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to go ahead right now and just invite you to pause the video and read Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through chapter 26, verse 5. And then when you have done that, unpause the video and we will continue. All right, moving on. So this is one of those passages you've probably heard numerous times. It may be one that you know well. It may be one of your favorites. For the sake of context, it is important to note that we'll go with pseudo parable. It's not really a parable. It doesn't carry some of the traditional parable markers, though it is definitely a story. It's sort of an apocalyptic imagining, not with apocalyptic there being some scary phrase, but just a note about the end. And it provides a summary for the previous, really 3 chapters, chapter 23, chapter 24, and chapter 25. Jesus has done a lot of teaching. He's answered a handful of questions. He's challenged the religious leaders of his day, and what he has cycled back to over and over and over is that how you live says everything about your faith. And this is one of those moments where I would point out, and this story is going to reinforce, that Jesus' disagreements with the Pharisees and the scribes, the people who's very often challenging him, was rarely doctrinal. And we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. When it comes down to it, Jesus and the Pharisees have a lot of agreement on belief. One of Jesus' teachings in the previous chapter, one of the things that connects to tonight's passage, was a statement where he said, "Listen to them, but do not do as they do." Which means, essentially, that what they say is worth hearing, but you can't use their lives as a baseline for understanding right belief in action. And right belief in action is really the idea that Jesus focuses on in these passages. Much like Matthew chapter 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, we now have this little sermon, this discourse, where Jesus is talking and teaching and answering questions, and what he circles back to over and over and over again is that how you live matters. And we're coming off of 2 parables where what Jesus is reinforcing is the idea that readiness equals living a certain way. Whether we're talking about the parable of the 10 bridesmaids or the parable of the 3 servants, now in the passage that you read tonight, it is reiterated over and over that how you act, how you live is connected to whether or not you get it. So with the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, the question is, were they prepared? The problem was not that they fell asleep. All 10 of them, the good and the bad, the wise and the foolish, all took a nap. No, there's nothing wrong with napping. Jesus takes a nap in a boat during the storm. Big fan of naps. Instead, the problem is that they weren't prepared to wait. They weren't prepared to continue to live. And so they fall away. They forget. Their lamp goes out. Their fire goes out. And then the parable of the 3 servants that we looked at last week. They're given this immense gift, which in the parable is the gospel, and 2 of them invest in the gospel. They share it, it grows, and one of them doesn't. And we talked in that one about how you view God matters, whether you view God as a harsh taskmaster like the last one did, or you view God as gracious and generous like the first 2 did. That affects your response. And then we get this story, this parable, where there are those on the left and those on the right, neither of whom expected that their actions towards the least of these would be the thing that gets brought up in this eschatological moment, this final judgment, which is the image we get here. And I always cringe a little bit at that phrase, even though I use it, because the point of the final judgment, a title that we added to it, it's not like Matthew entitled all of these different sections, is not judgment itself. And in fact, it seems like the judging has already taken place. Instead, the focus is on how they lived. There's no conversation about orthodox belief. There's nothing about doctrine. And that's not to say that that's not important, but here in this moment, the question seems to be, what did you do with it? It's the same question that Jesus has been asking in chapters 23 and 24 and up until this point in chapter 25. So the point is not the judgment itself, but it's the reflection. Again, neither of them are see this sort of least of these actions as what was most important. The sheep are just as surprised as the goats. And it's not like they were out there just like thinking, okay, if I find somebody who looks miserable and do something good for them, Jesus is going to reward me. Like, the fact that that's not part of their process is important here. Instead, what's being emphasized is that people who love Jesus, who love God, this is the type of thing that naturally comes out of them. This is the type of life that's generated when you interpret Scripture through this lens of love that Jesus has offered up as the lens for understanding the law repeatedly in Matthew's gospel. And then, if that's not the type of life that your view of Scripture generates, then you're going to be pretty surprised too, because you were overlooking, you were ignoring, you were judging, you were rejecting those people at arm's length. And the other thing to point out here is who Jesus identifies with, who God places himself amongst, and it's not the righteous ones who are doing the good things. It's that God sees God's self in this story in vulnerability. Not unimportant, given that Jesus is about to be, very vulnerable on the cross, and that lives of service inevitably require vulnerability. Like, all of those points can be pulled in here as well. And then, if you just keep looking at all of the different angles this passage provides, you have, just the very, basic good that needs meeting is. And I think that's one of those things that historically, one of the questions that has often been asked in churches where I have worked, and this certainly exists before me, and has been going on and still goes on in a lot of ways, after you do some sort of community service event, is well, who did it get to church? And at some point we have to accept that doing good for the sake of doing good, because we're the type of people who love God and have been shaped into people who do good and look out for the vulnerable, is enough because God is in those people. And maybe trying to tally our successes by human standards as opposed to God's, which is laid out here, is a little short-sighted. And I think that's an important thing for us to pay attention to here as well. I'm looking through my notes in the column over to the side to try and make sure that I've covered everything. I think maybe the most instructive part of this passage that never gets looked at, though, is verses 1 through 5 of 26. Because it's a transition point. It's not part of the parable or the story that Jesus has been telling, and it doesn't connect to the next part. It's a pivot point, but what it pivots on matters. Because what Jesus has been talking about is the actions that pour out of the heart of human beings. And whether that's going to be one of judgment or one of service, really, like if you read through the passage before. And we get this snapshot of those two distinct paths, taken to extremes, true, but distinct paths in verse 26, where Jesus looks at his disciples and says, the crucifixion is coming. And Jesus' action in the crucifixion is one of sacrifice, one of giving, one of meeting the needs of others. And you compare that to Caiaphas, the high priest, and the other religious leaders who have already moved towards murder. So to take life or to give life are the two images that these passages then pivot on. And which is better, to take life or to give, to save it? It's a question that has already been asked in Matthew's gospel by Jesus, in a conversation about whether it was okay to do good or evil on the Sabbath. And I think we circle back to that point, reinforced on a larger scale, that how you answer those questions matters. And in this case, Jesus answers from a place of love and goes to sacrifice. And the high priests and Sanhedrin, they answer from a place of fear and of power and of selfishness. And so their move is to take it. And I think if we make the mistake to believe that we could never possibly be as short-sighted as them, then we're out of line. We'll go with that. I think what these parables teach us, what this story forces us to consider, is that human beings are capable of all types of actions, depending on what those influences and priorities are. And you can wind up doing some really terrible things without thinking too much about it. Just as a plug before I end, next year will be the 30th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda. I'm not going to nerd out right now, other than to say that at the time that it took place, something like 95% of Rwandans were members of churches, regularly attended. The churches were huge community centers, and actually became places of violence without thought. And I'm doing a lot of reading on that this year because it connects to some of my other areas of study previously, and I think it's important to pay attention to for us, because if you do a lot of reading, what you find is they fell into a very old, very common trap of either categorizing what they were doing as good or simply ignoring good and evil for the sake of expediency. And if we don't see ways in which we fall into those traps, then I don't think we're being terribly honest with ourselves sometimes. So, I think Matthew chapters 23, 24, and 25 reinforce over and over this notion that what we believe shows up in our lives and how we live matters. And I hope as you've worked your way through, you've caught those notes and it's forced you to think deeper and harder about how you view God and what that does in your life and whether or not there's some adjustments that need to be made, or you better than I do. Um, but I hope you can read these passages and honestly consider the interaction between belief and action. So, all right, glad you were with us tonight. Be back at it next week with chapter 26. Have a good evening.